Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ninth Zoom presentation by Thrive. And we've chosen our speakers and our topics, always with the goal to educate, engage, inspire, and all of that to try to generate an even better Amherstburg. Delighted to see two council members on, Pat Simone and Mark Renault. Both of you have been really great. Taking advantage of our Zoom broadcast, and I hope it educates you as well and engages and inspires you as Thrive moves forward with all of our initiatives. Next slide. So our approach continues to be, we'll use data, but it's always evidence-based, evidence-backed. We're mindful of international and domestic best practices. Some people will say, like, why do you compare yourself to Paris? Well, because sometimes Paris has a great idea and can be scaled back for a small town like Amherstburg. And we always follow the science. And it's not only the science of health and wellness, but today it's the science of climate change. And importantly, we try to stay very positive. Okay, Corey? Right now, Thrive Amherstburg is presenting white papers to Town Council on numerous topics with the hope they will be reflected in the 2022 budget. Addressing the climate crisis is one of them. Even small Amherstburg has to do its part. Next slide. I'm not wearing this t-shirt tonight, but I do, and I often get commented on it. And on this black t-shirt is a quote: "The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it." Next quote. So, we can all do something. And the book tonight by author Lloyd Alter, Living the 1.5 degree lifestyle, and that's 1.5 degrees Celsius. And Lloyd will talk about why individual climate action matters more than ever. I have an expression I've heard, and I've used it a few times myself, that the best game warden is a reformed poacher. Best game warden is a reformed poacher. And I think that's Lloyd. From driving a Porsche and building luxury condominiums, today he rides a bike and writes for Tree Hugger. That's quite a change in lifestyle, and you're going to hear about it. Clearly, Lloyd had an epiphany when it came to climate change. We'd like to welcome Lloyd virtually to Amherstburg. Lloyd is a writer, public speaker, a former architect, and has published over 14,000 articles on Tree Hugger and Mother Nature. And now an author of Living the 1.5 degree lifestyle. And if you want to know what he'll talk about is a 1.5 degree lifestyle, and he'll explain it to you, is, I think, as I understand it, then we all get 2.5 tons of CO2 to use per year. And what I understand from his book, I'm using way too much more than that. It's an incredibly researched book on climate change, some hard truth, some surprises for me, some ideas on how. It's kind of like a manual, if you like, and really makes the point that we can all do our part to fight climate change. So Lloyd, welcome to Amherstburg. The screen is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Now I'll just do this technical thing. So it's a real pleasure to be here. This book was my first book, though I've been writing for quite a while. I used to be an architect. This was my most famous building right at the corner of Queen and Yonge in Toronto. It's now been totally renovated. Everything I ever designed has either been turned into a condo or taken down, which is why I decided to become a real estate developer, because I could hire good architects and the stuff would last. And this building is quite well known as luxury condos. And this was a famous school in George Brown College in Kensington Market that I renovated. 20 years ago, as what often happens in the development industry, I had a little falling out with partners and had to look for a new job. And I started working on prefabricated housing. And to promote the housing, I started writing a blog before there were blogs. And pretty soon I got hired to be a full-time writer. And that's how I ended up where I am today. But we have to go back more than 20 years ago. We have to go back 50 years ago to Jimmy Carter, to what was really the start of the energy crisis. And we got to remember that this was political, the energy crisis. It was about the Arab oil embargo after the Yom Kippur War, and about reducing America's dependence on foreign oil. And that's where the first time anyone ever saw solar panels, when Jimmy Carter put them on the roof of the White House. And everything was about energy. We've had energy on our brains ever since, energy conservation. But nobody ever took energy conservation too seriously, because in that time, energy got really, really cheap. I mean, they developed fracking, and suddenly we were drowning in natural gas, and we developed the oil sands, and suddenly oil production was driving the Canadian economy. So there wasn't a great deal of seriousness ever about really, truly dealing with energy. And through the whole time, we pretty much ignored the fact that the temperature was warming, because burning all of that energy was creating carbon dioxide that was going into the atmosphere. It got hotter and hotter. And then finally, in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement came up with agreements about a couple of things: a carbon budget, the maximum amount of carbon we can put into the air, a schedule. We want to reduce it rapidly to get down to almost zero by 2050 and down 45% by 2030. And a budget, which we mentioned, which at the time they did this was 420 gigatons of carbon, which we're going through quickly. It's a fixed budget. This document here, this calculator, says that we're down to 275 right now. And so what that all meant was that we have a collective carbon footprint that we have to match. Now, a lot of people say this isn't true, that the carbon footprint was made up by BP. British Petroleum invented the term carbon footprint to blame us for it. Well, this isn't true. In fact, the idea of the carbon footprint was a Canadian invention by Dr. William Rees at the UBC. He now lives in Toronto, who wrote about our ecological footprint. Others say that it's just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions. And I've seen tweets saying 100 companies are responsible, so don't blame my air conditioning. 100 companies are responsible, not my Bitcoin. 100 companies are responsible, so I can eat meat. I mean, it's used as an excuse by almost everyone, it seems. But it's not true. Those companies, those 100 companies, are actually making products that we buy. 90% of those emissions come from burning the fossil fuels that they make. And that's our choice in the way we live and what we do to buy gasoline. It was our choice to design buildings and homes that run on natural gas. These are consumption issues, not production issues. Now, about 3 years ago, a study was put out by a group in Finland, actually, and I learned about it from this woman, Rosalind Reedhead, an activist in London, England, who was going to try and hit the target for 2050 and live on a 1 ton of carbon budget. I thought this was totally crazy, and I started looking at and reading the study and said, where does this number come from, this 1 ton? Well, where it came from was in this lifestyle study, dividing up the total carbon budget, taking the schedule by which we have to reduce it, and coming up with how much per person that we each can have. And you can see here the circle around 2.5 at 2030. And that's what I decided would be my target in this exercise. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but in fact, half of the world is living under 2.5 tons now, and they are living in what's called energy poverty. You know, you can see Canada way up over 15, according to this, and, Tanzania down at like 1. I mean, something's not fair in the world in this situation. Now, just yesterday, the new updated version of this report that I based my study on was released, and it's very interesting. It's an updated report and expanded the number of countries that are actually evaluated. And Canada was in the list this time. So the first time I could really see where do Canadians sit in relation to other countries? These are what they call lifestyle carbon emissions. If you go back to there were two lines. There's the upper line, which are the total emissions, and the lifestyle emissions are what the studies have said we actually can in some way control. And so here you can see the lifestyle emissions for Canadians at about 14.2 tons per year. And that was out of a total emissions on average per Canadian of about 17. Now, these were all interesting numbers, but what did I do with them? Well, what I tried to do was to look at the various components that came up with all of those emissions, which are basically what we eat, how we live, how we get around, the stuff we buy, and our leisure footprint, sort of what we do in our spare time. And I basically built a massive spreadsheet where I basically checked every single thing that I did every day, how I got around. You can see here the categories are again, food, housing, mobility, consumer goods, and leisure. And I tracked them every day. But how did you know how much of this actually, where did these numbers come from? Well, there was a very good book written in Britain called How Bad Are the Bananas, which gave an English look at the thing, but there were other data sources around. The most important thing is you had to understand that it's not just the amount of energy that it takes something to run, it's the amount of carbon it took to make. It's what is called in the building industry embodied carbon. You know, if I buy a Haier Chinese-made air conditioner, the energy, the carbon released making the air conditioner was offshored to China. But it's really on my side of the ledger. I have to consider it. So it's my carbon. It's what in the building industry is called embodied carbon, the carbon that it takes to make something. In their cases, all the industry underneath the house that you get is the embodied carbon. I always thought it was a stupid name. And I thought it should be called upfront carbon because it is upfront now. It's in the air now. And so I'll be talking a lot about upfront carbon in this exercise because it's a critically important concept. Now, the first bit that I looked at in this, because it's where it was in the book, and what we eat. And here again, you can see Canada is leading the pack. Even with, I thought Brazilians ate a lot of meat, but we even beat Brazilians in the amount of meat that we eat. And I started looking, well, what is the footprint of the food that we eat? It's really hard to figure out exactly. Let's take my favorite takeout meal, Swiss chalet. You know, you think, well, what's this? Well, first you've got the chicken. I had to look at what is the carbon footprint of a chicken. I had the information from Britain. I didn't have it from Canada, where it's probably trucked farther. Then I went into the catalogs and looked what's the energy consumption of the rotisserie machine that actually cooks the chicken. Then I took all the packaging and I weighed it because I know how many grams of carbon there are for plastic. I had originally given up Swiss chalet because I felt buried in plastic every time I went, and it was surprisingly small. And the killer of it all was the delivery guy driving his Toyota Corolla from not even my nearest Swiss chalet to my house, but one 7 kilometers away that like dominates the thing. The amount of carbon from driving dominated everything else. There were other sources of data, like this wonderful Oxford University group, the Our World in Data, and you find some really interesting things. Like red meat, beef is absolutely the worst by far because it's a ruminant and it all turns into methane and all goes straight to the atmosphere. Shrimp are next because they're shipped all around the world. Hothouse tomatoes, Ontario hothouse tomatoes, they heat it with natural gas. It's hard to believe, but tomatoes have a higher carbon footprint than fish. And cheese, my daughter's a cheesemonger in Toronto. I can't tell her I can't buy any more cheese. And even that's all worse than pork or chicken. And then you get into the vegetables. So people say, oh, I'll be a vegetarian. Well, being a vegetarian isn't that good if you still eat a lot of cheese. And others say, well, I'll be a vegan. Well, being a vegan isn't all that good if you eat tomatoes that are grown in hothouses and lettuces that are shipped all the way from California. A lot of people said, well, the shipping doesn't matter that much. But from my studies, I found that they really ignored the cold chain, the refrigerated trailers, the leaking refrigerants, the cold warehouses. It's been underestimated, and it's really a big portion of the carbon footprint. So the main thing I found was, first of all, we have to stop eating so much red meat, but doesn't mean we can't eat meat. We have to stop wasting so much food. 40% of the food that is grown is wasted in some form, in going to the grocery store and going stale dated and put in the bin, in sitting at the back of our fridge and turning into compost. A lot of it is wasted, 40% like that. Another way that food is wasted that nobody thinks about is by going right through us because of portion size. If you look at the portion sizes that people serve themselves, they're far bigger than they used to be. If you look at all of these fast food things, everything is twice the size that it used to be. And the portions at home are much bigger than they used to be. So this is actually another massive form of food waste. We used to, when my wife was writing about food, we basically tried to live what was essentially a 19th century Ontario diet, which was a lot of root vegetables, a lot of potatoes, a lot of things that you could keep all year in a root cellar. Plus, I must commit a lot of meat, that people used to eat a great deal of meat. But all the Scots and the English and everyone who came here, they didn't know the joys either of Asian food and spices that you can now can make tofu and things like that and get a much more varied diet than you did in an Ontario 19th century diet. My wife also does all the canning every year, so we have tomatoes all year, fresh tomatoes. I had to give up my favorite orange juice in plastic, and I had to cut back on the martinis because alcohol's got a pretty high carbon footprint, but it wasn't too bad. In the end, it came down to some pretty simple things. If you can go vegan and eliminate all meat, fish, and dairy, great. But if, like me, it's too hard, get rid of the red meat and lamb. Eat less dairy, pork, and fish, less of everything, smaller portions, shorten the food chain and eat local, learn to love leftovers, manage portion sizes. And if you do takeout, try to get some that isn't driven for miles. The next was how we live. And here I'm going to talk a bit about Toronto. Then again, from yesterday's graph, we're way off the chart in terms of the footprint of how we live. Japan is actually surprisingly close since they live in tiny houses and apartments, but they're really leaky. Where I live in Toronto is up near an area called Bathurst and St. Clair. And when Amherstburg was already a thriving community, this was like 1900, the whole area was either farmland or estates of the rich. The Spadina estate is there and the Ardwald estate. They all lived up at the top of the hill. And it was all separated from where I live now by the ravines. And this was St. Clair Avenue at the time. And that's not an easy trek for anyone to get home at the end of the day. So, there wasn't much development there. Then where am I? I lost my slide. Then in 1912, they filled it all in. They had lots of stuff that came out of every coal furnace, all the ash and all the gook and all the waste. So they basically filled this up with toxic garbage. Sorry, I'm losing my slide again. Where am I? Oh. I lost my cursor for a second. I'm very sorry. Oh, I can do it this way. Okay. So they filled it all up. This guy who lived at the corner of the mansion, Bathurst and St. Clair, is watching the tracks go in, probably thinking of selling out and moving to Amherstburg. And the tracks go in, and this is how it looks today. Pretty much the same as it did then. And the streetcar went out, and the streetcar is what enabled the development to happen. Basically, I live in what is called a streetcar suburb. And in 1890, it was all farmland. And 25 years later, it was all built out. And it was a suburb with narrow houses where everyone could walk up to the street, to the main street. And that's my house in the middle, a developer special from 1913. And St. Clair looks pretty much the same now as it did then, but more development. Now, you were mentioning earlier, Richard, about learning from Paris. It's very much what we would call, what is called in Paris now, a 15-minute city, that I can get everything I need within walking distance. And I can rent office space. I can go to my doctor in the new clinic that just opened. And like Amherstburg, it's a format, it's an urban model that worked everywhere. People didn't have cars, so they lived relatively close, within walking or horse distance from the town where they could buy their supplies. And it worked very well for the people who lived in the area. And I've been looking at all of these postcards, old postcards of Amherstburg, and there were like thriving businesses there. And then the cars came in, but there were still all the businesses that happened. And then after the Second World War, everything kind of changed. The cars took over, the streets got widened, a lot of buildings would have been lost at the time. But there's still a community, there are still buildings, there are people who are opening businesses, trying to thrive on that character that you got either on my St. Clair Avenue or near Dalhousie Street, as you get in small towns that were designed around people who walked into town. And you can't separate how you get around from the look of your community. As this planner says, land use and transportation, it's the same thing. How you get around determines how you live. So when after the Second World War, Dwight Eisenhower built the interstate highway and defense system, the whole point of it was to lower the density. So if the Russians lobbed a bomb over, it wouldn't take out everything. They needed lots of bombs. So they built the highway and missed concrete and missed blacktop, cut the ribbons. And the next thing you know, we had suburbia. And it was the car that determined the form. My house could not exist without the streetcar, and these houses couldn't exist without the car. And it became a style and pattern of life that people wanted to live in. It's what they still want to live in. If you look at what Elon Musk is selling, he calls it the future we want. The difference is it's electric now. You've got 2 Teslas in the garage, a power wall in the garage, and a solar shingles on the roof on your big suburban house. The problem is it doesn't scale. It doesn't have any density. It's really, really expensive. We have to, I think, start thinking about the more European model. In Vienna, everybody lives in apartments. Nobody lives in a house. And in Munich, these lovely little buildings that everybody lives in. Families live in these, and single family houses are virtually unheard of. We know how to do all of this in our communities now. We know how to build with new materials. Everybody's talking about building with wood because wood has very low upfront carbon emissions compared to steel and concrete. We know how to build super insulated houses like this one in 1974. The Saskatchewan Conservation House was the first of what are now called passive houses, houses that need almost no energy to run. We know how to get off natural gas now with heat pumps that can heat and cool our houses and our hot water and run on a fraction of electricity that electric heat used to. We know that we have to get off natural gas, even though the Premier is trying to expand it into rural Ontario. So in this, we found that we have to use more natural materials with low embodied carbon in existing buildings, reduce demand as much as possible by sealing and insulating attics and making up the difference with heat pumps. And we need to have 15-minute cities, walkable communities, bicycle lane networks, all of these alternatives that will let you survive without a car. And this section, How We Move, is about essentially the problem of the car. Again, in Canada, it dominates. Now, for years, the governments and everyone would try to increase energy efficiency of cars to get better mileage, increase efficiency, but efficiency failed us. As cars got more efficient, they got bigger. People, this is the reviewer in One Green magazine was asked to review this car and had his kid stand in front of it. And, he said he can't believe this thing. And this has, again, always been the dream. The car, the suburban house, maybe the boat. And the only difference now is it's an electric dream. But cars are cars. They still block the sidewalk. When you're in the city, regular cars, electric cars, autonomous cars, Uber, Lyft cars, they're all congestion. And the most important thing to remember about electric cars is what I talked about before, the upfront carbon emissions of making them. They're quite significant. You can see here on this chart that an average European car on the left and a Tesla, depending on where it is driven and how clean the electricity is on the right, it's still half as bad as a regular car. And then we have the new Ford F-150 pickup. Everybody is excited about this electric pickup that's coming out, but there's probably 40 tons of upfront carbon emitted making this thing. Now, if you divide that over the life of the car and compare it to my little gas-powered Subaru, my Subaru has a lower footprint per kilometer than this massive truck. And when I wrote an article about this, actually my boss of the company that owns us in New York said to me, you can't do this. We want to promote electric cars. And I say, yes, but we can't promote electric pickups because of the embodied carbon. But in the end, this car fixation is going to bury us, whether it's an electric car or a gasoline car. There's just too much stuff in them. To do my project, I knew I couldn't drive, and I went and bought an electric bike. And I just love it. I bought a Dutch style bike that's designed for older people like me that you can step into, that's really easy to use. In the winter 2 years, if you dress appropriately, you don't get cold. I didn't have to do this at all last year because it never got that cold. And people say, oh, you got to be young, you got to be fit, you got to be this, you got to be that. It's too hot, it's too cold. I'm 68 years old and I get dressed like this and I get in my bike and I have a fine time. The electric bike makes it much easier for older people to go farther. It's not nearly as much work. You don't get sweaty because you're not working as hard, so you can do it all year round quite easily. We also have to think about making it safe and easy to do it by putting in the infrastructure that's necessary. I loved this in Vienna, where there's a lane for walking, a lane for biking, a lane for sitting while you wait for the streetcar, a lane for the streetcar, and then a lane for traffic. When Toronto put in all of this temporary bike lane stuff because of the pandemic, it looked a lot like Vienna. There's a lane for walking, a lane for biking, a lane for driving, and a lane for the streetcar, just like Vienna. Of course, we're going to rip all that out, but it was really nice while it lasted. The real problem I found is flying. It's just almost impossible to do. When we got bought by a big American company, I had to go to New York to meet the new boss. I can't say I got to worry about my carbon footprint. And in a 30-hour business trip, I blew through a month's worth of carbon just because the plane and the limos and everything else. So the key thing here is, drive less, get out of the car. I didn't say get rid of one. We still have one. I have a cottage up north and we drive up there in June and come back in September. So, but you have to cut back. And I strongly recommend getting an e-bike. And you have to pick where you live to make sure you can actually get things you need nearby. How am I doing for time? I forgot to set the timer at the beginning.
You're doing just fine.
Okay, I don't have that much more. The last one, not the last one, but close to, the other big one is consumption of stuff that we buy. And again, here from the new report that came out yesterday is Canada, again, is way over everybody else with our consumer goods. Now, I didn't think this would be a big deal. The first report didn't think it was going to be a big deal, but I have this addiction to Apple products. I own almost every single one of them. I've got my watch, I got my pods, I've got my big screen that I'm looking at, I got my iMac, I've got my MacBook and my iPad, but they add up. Even my little phone is only weighs a couple of grams, but it's got 80 kilograms of carbon built into it. It's solid upfront carbon. Only 13% of its full lifetime emissions comes from using the phone. The rest is all in the phone. Now, why is this doing this again? My iMac is almost a kilogram, almost a ton, 824 kilograms. My MacBook Air, 174. This is a lot of heavy weight. You can't lift any of these things. My iPad Pro, 113. Even my dinky little watch is 38 kilograms of carbon. I found that the total of the emissions from the Apple products that I owned, spread out over the 3 years that they say their calculations are based on, was the single biggest thing in my carbon footprint after the natural gas that's running my furnace. It's enough to make you want to go out and get a beer, which is why I'm going to talk about beer. The beer store is actually perhaps the best example of how we should be living our lives. You take those bottles, they go back every time, they get washed and they get refilled. They go around about 34 times each. 90% of them go back. The government is doing everything it can to put the beer store out of business. If you go into them now, you can barely find bottles. Almost everything is in cans. The whole point of this is, I don't know what the whole point is, but the beer model is actually something we should be emulating. It's something we used to have everywhere. You may remember milkmen from when you were a kid. I do. That's how we used to get our milk in Toronto. You may remember Coke had bottling companies in almost every community because doing a returnable bottle system is expensive. You can't take them that far. And so you have local bottlers, local business in your town doing this stuff. Just O'Keefe Ale, one beer company that no longer exists, had 5 breweries across Ontario. Then this guy, Bill Coors, came along, and he and his company invented the 2-part aluminum can in the late 50s. And instead of patenting it, he actually gave the rights to it to anyone in the business. They said, this will revolutionize business. And it did. He was able to centralize beer production in one place in Colorado, and because of that wonderful interstate highway system, deliver it by transport trailer right across the country. And basically all those independent brewers went out of business. McDonald's and other food chains saw the same thing. They've decided, why should I be paying for big spaces and tables and waiters and tables and chairs when I can get rid of all that? People are driving on the highways and we'll outsource it all to the customer. And that's what they did. They outsourced all of that to us. And we'd never seen this before. People actually didn't know what to do. There weren't very many waste baskets, and people would just leave their stuff everywhere. And the industry knew this was going to be a problem. So they all got together and they started these campaigns to train us to pick up our garbage and make it go away. And they invented recycling because the landfills were getting filled. So they'd made recycling into a virtue. And what a success it was, training us from the earliest age with toys that recycling is such a wonderful thing. Paw Patrol does it now. I mean, every company is doing this, recycling. So much so that a study was done where they asked people, what is the thing that you do that lets you lead a longer and healthier life? And what is on top? Recycling. So we've been, in a sense, brainwashed into it, brainwashed into using single-use plastics and single-use packaging, and we don't feel bad about it because it's recycled. And we learned it really isn't. It was a bit of a lie. Some of it is recycled. When it is recycled, most of it is downcycled. 40% of it is landfilled, 14% is incinerated, 32% goes into our lakes and our rivers and our oceans, and only 2% is actually fully recycled. What we are is working for the petrochemical industry, which is making single-use plastics out of ethylene and chlorine. And they think we're going to pick them up and we're going to recycle them. But we're terrible at it. Even in a Tim Hortons parking lot where there are bins everywhere, people just throw their stuff out the window. And I've walked down the highway sometimes, you can just see it all littered down the side of the street. We're not good at this at all. We have to think in our whole life like that beer store, like the things go back. We used to go into a coffee shop, we would sit down, we would drink a small cup of coffee because they want the turnaround. They don't want you hogging their seat all day. So they didn't get those big 20-ounce coffees. You got a little one. And that's what we have to do. And we have to think about what we buy really carefully. And for any consumer good, the best strategy is to buy high quality with timeless design, maintain it really well, and use it for as long as you can. I won't talk much about leisure other than point out that 10 years ago, I used to have a lot of fun driving 2 hours north, getting electrically winched up a hill to slide down electrically made artificial snow, to then spend 2 hours driving home again. And last year, I tried basically bungee cording my cross-country skis to my e-bike, and the one day we had snow, going up to Cedarvale Park in the Midtown Toronto and having a wonderful, wonderful time without all of that carbon footprint. Because what I've found through this whole exercise, it's not about going without. It's not about not doing things. It's about making more sensible choices about what you do. In the States, it's all very political. This guy, Sebastian Gorka, said, they want to take your pickup truck. They want to rebuild your home. They want to take away your hamburgers. This was a political thing for this Trump advisor. And you know what? He's right, we do. But we still want you to have a nice little electric vehicle. We want you to have a cozy, warm, well-insulated home. And we want to have really good food, even beyond burgers, fake hamburgers that taste almost as good as the real thing. It's not about giving things up. It became clear to conclude, that when I did this, that it's not all so easy, that how much you drive is totally a function of where you live. The carbon footprint of a loaf of bread is going to be very different if it's in the little boulangerie that's within walking distance of me, or whether it's frozen dough that's been cooked up at Walmart and that I have to drive home. It's hard to change little things where everything is interconnected. So you have to think of it all as the bigger picture where everything is connected. And you have to think about sufficiency. How much do you really need? The embodied carbon of making things is as important, if not more important, than the actual carbon cost of running it. So this is true in my electronics, it's true in our homes, our cars, our buildings, just about everything made of metal or silicon. And as I said before, how you get around is what determines almost everything. It's much easier to live a low carbon life if you live in a place designed before the car took over, be it a small town or an older city. And for the people who don't have that, it's really hard. I'll end with this shot, which I talk about to people in Toronto. It's Stockholm in 1928. And Stockholm's pretty cold, but the population there in 1928 got around in streetcars and on bicycles and a few taxis here and there. And I really thought that this could be a vision for Toronto in 2028, if we really wanted it to be, if we were willing to invest in the right kinds of transit and the right kinds of infrastructure for bikes and for alternatives to driving cars. Thanks very much.
Well, Lloyd, you've really brought the book to life, and you've made me feel really bad about driving a Tesla. So all the embodied carbon in it, and I understand that having read the book. The only thing, my salvation is if I drive it a long time, and I'm at 98,000 kilometers, and there, I never see a gas station, I never see a repair shop. So I guess the way I'm going to start feeling really holy again. Because until I read your book, I felt pretty damn holy about driving a Tesla.
Right.
I'm just going to have to drive it for 250,000 kilometers, I think.
Well, you're absolutely right. That is the key, because you make it last. When they did those calculations, they based it actually, I think, on 100,000 miles, or what's that, 180,000 kilometers. And as soon as you go over that, it's like all free. And given that there are so few moving parts and they're such simple designs, nobody knows how long these things are going to last. But I suspect electric cars are going to last twice as long as gasoline powered cars, just because of their simplicity. And as you say, the lack of service that they need.
So listen, I'd like to throw it open to the crowd, but to get the ball rolling, you said there was a quote in your book that I found really interesting. Fossil fuels are the new cigarettes.
Yes, like if you think back, when I talk about personal responsibility, I think the hardest thing, if anyone ever smoked, and I did, the hardest thing you can do really is, why is my image out of focus with this expensive camera? The hardest thing you can do is give up smoking, but there were lots of different reasons to do it. There was your personal health. It became socially unacceptable. The government changed the rules. About 5 different forces came together to actually make people give up smoking. And this is much the same thing that we have to do with fossil fuels. First of all, I think that everybody knows the health dangers that are being caused by climate change and the reasons that government would regulate to have more efficient engines that use less fuel. Second of all, I think it might well be socially unacceptable in a couple of years to see someone driving around, one person perched over this giant F-150, because once people get a bigger understanding about the harm that they do and realize what embodied carbon, upfront carbon is, I think that we have to treat fossil fuels in the end like we did cigarettes and say, okay, we've got to look down the road at banning them, limiting them, making them more expensive, making them less acceptable, making them socially unacceptable until they're gone.
Unfortunately, that's not the trend with SUVs. They're weigh a lot more, and they're, you drive down the street and you're seeing a lot of those. So listen, why don't we, Corey, can you read out any questions online, or anyone want to jump in and ask Lloyd questions? I've got more for him, but I'd rather you ask them.
Yeah, so if you have any questions on Zoom, just go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom and we'll ask you to unmute. But in the meantime, we've got a question here in the chat. So just a comment first from Philippa. Love the picture of Stockholm 100 years ago. And then Dylan says, how long did it take to make positive carbon choices habitual?
Well, I started doing that long before I wrote the book, simply because in Toronto, driving was getting so ridiculous. I preferred to take transit or my bike to get downtown. We were always eating less meat because my daughter became a vegetarian, and it's healthy. So when I finally decided to actually sit down and really do it and write the book, it was pretty much almost instant. I mean, I had a few failures. My wife really wanted a steak one night, and you can look at my spreadsheet and I can show it. I think the worst night of all was when we went out for a Hungarian dinner, and it was 2 weeks worth of carbon just in this one giant meal on Bloor Street with all this stuff that came with it. I wouldn't say it's 100% habitual yet. We still have breakdowns. The nice thing about doing it on a spreadsheet like I did is, well, if you break down here, it's not the end of the world. It's not like I feel about cigarettes. I haven't had one in 24 years, and I know if I just had one, it would be done. Whereas with this, I had a lapse. I took a drive, I had a piece of meat. It's not the end of the world over the scope of the whole year. It's all a matter of steps towards that. So to answer your question, it's didn't take long, and it's not yet totally habitual.
Okay. Any other questions out there?
So I'll jump in here again. So the carbon tax, they're implementing it. Ontario fights it. Feds are pushing it. Can it make a difference? How much higher does it have to get? Talk a little bit about that, Lloyd.
Well, I think it can make a huge difference. I think that it's basically a consumption tax on carbon, and the higher it is, the better alternatives look. Look at what's happened in the last 2 weeks, in the last month with natural gas prices. Natural gas prices in the UK have tripled, and in the United States they've doubled, and in Canada they're going to be going up really fast too. And suddenly people are talking like they haven't in years. Maybe I should insulate and caulk my house. When things get more expensive, people start getting concerned about it. And I think that's the beauty of a carbon tax, that it makes high carbon things more painful. And by distributing the money back to the people, the way the people who aren't paying so much carbon tax, it doubles the benefit of it. But I think that carbon taxes are really a great incentive to clean up your act.
Okay. Questions, please. You don't want to just have me ask them all night. Okay, so, we just had a federal election.
Yeah.
Change was in the news a bit. Was it a lot of greenwashing, or is it real?
Oh, God, it's very, very depressing. There's a line, a lot of people, the big conflict going on in the movement here is where people say personal responsibility doesn't matter. We've got to take political action and do something political. But as I respond in the book, and as I respond to them, is I vote every 4 years, but I eat 3 times a day. Voting, if you looked at all 4 parties, even the Green Party's platform, the NDP party platform, them all, not one of them had a really solid plan that you could believe in, that they would actually do. It was just completely depressing. And I mean, it came out today in the Globe and Mail that Canada doesn't have a chance of making its 2030 targets. And, politically, the Liberals have to deal with Alberta, and Conservatives have to deal with conservatism, and the NDP has to deal with the union guys making cars. And I don't know what the Green Party is dealing with, but it was just, for me, truly disappointing election from every point of view in terms of what people are promising to do, which is why I then take the position that what we all have to do is get those politicians to change their minds about these things by setting examples, by saying no more highways, we want bike infrastructure. We say let's not expand airports anymore. In the UK, the leading activist group right now is called, of all things, Insulate Brit, which is not exactly an inspiring name, but they're actually lying in front of highways and blocking runways and doing all of these, trying to convince the populations, the governments, that people really care about the carbon issue. So we need the political action, and we need to set personal examples, and we just need better politicians.
So I know there were 2 questions there, and one will be an advertisement by me. If you want to find Lloyd's book, it's at the River Bookshop, right in the front display as you come through the door. And then I think I saw Lori with a question. Corey, what was that question?
Yeah, we know we have such a small percentage of, oh, sorry, jumped ahead here. Do we know why such a small percentage of our recycled goods are actually recycled?
Well, it's because the whole thing was a scam from the beginning, in the sense that they were shipping it all to China, where the labor was cheap enough to pick it all apart and to get the valuable stuff out and then burn or just throw away the rest. And when the Chinese government want to take they were shipping us stuff that they were making, and the containers had to go back. So they were just filling them with plastic garbage and shipping them back to China. And when China stopped doing this, everybody had to suddenly have a look in the mirror. And, the value per pound of the recycled material is worth far less than what they actually get for it. And in many cases, we've seen, my daughter has told me she's seen the truck come down our street, pick up the green bin and the blue bin, and put it right in with the garbage all in one place, because it's all just sort of environmental theater now. They can't get any money for the recycled goods. And that's why we have to go back and really think about the whole system of recycling and going back to the full returnable system. I don't know if you have it in Amherstburg, but a store just opened up 2 blocks from me that is nothing but bulk goods. You go in with your own jar and you can fill everything up. It's sort of like a bulk barn, but for soap and for cosmetics and for everything else. And one could live almost entirely zero waste that way. And that's how we're moving. But it's a real thing, you know, it's all theater right now, the recycling that we're doing. Even aluminum, which is the highest value recycled product, ends up being downcycled. It's not good enough quality to go into your MacBook, and it's not good enough quality even for cars, and certainly not for airplanes. So it's downcycled into cheaper goods, and it gets lower value, and to the point where companies don't even want it, and they're importing aluminum for cans. They're not even making cans out of recycled aluminum sometimes. So the whole system is busted.
So, Lloyd, decoupling, tell us about the concept of decoupling.
Well, the concept of decoupling, and it's also appropriate to the next question about county residents who are farmers, concept of decoupling is simply decoupling energy use from the function that we're trying to do. So for instance, with your Tesla, you have actually decoupled your operating energy from fossil fuels. And being in Ontario, you're filling it up with 94% clean electricity. You've decoupled your car's operation from this. And you can look at almost everything and figure out, how do you decouple it from energy? You know, what is a substitute that a different way of doing it that doesn't require so much energy? And so they've looked at it. Can you actually do it? You know, I made a joke in the book about Gwyneth Paltrow when she separated from her husband. She called it conscious uncoupling. That was her fancy name for divorce. And I sort of talked about what you're doing with your car, and what I try to do is conscious decoupling. We're just trying to make our choice of what decouples the energy source from the function that I'm trying to serve. Does that make sense?
A good example is going from car to bike, right?
Yes. Yes, you've decoupled your transportation from its carbon, and decoupling your food. You're not eating meat. You're really decoupling methane from your diet.
Okay, Corey, getting near the end here with some other questions that we can address.
Yeah, so I think you touched on the county residents here. I'm from Hamilton, but now live in Essex County. We had a green program there, and now I do backyard composting. But is there a value to begin a green bin program in Windsor, Essex?
Well, first I want to go back to the farm question about the angst in the community. I mean, the farm community is a big consumer of natural gas. It's what keeps all the barns, the chicken barns and all the hothouses and everything going. The carbon is a big issue for it. And I'm a city boy. I don't know the answer to those questions, but it's one that we really have to wrestle with. It's really important. We've lost, in the book, I talk about how important it is to shorten our food chain, to keep it local, to not depend on getting everything from California, that we have to get back to supporting our local farmers in that. And so I completely understand the issue of the angst, and I wish I had a better answer to it, other that we all should be absolutely supporting our local farmers at every opportunity that we can.
Corey?
And as for the green bin question, again, it all depends really on the technologies. You know, I would suspect that in a community where most people have backyards where they can do backyard composting, that it's probably a better solution than municipal composting. I think 50% of the stuff that goes into the Toronto composting system are little green bags of dog poop. And I'm not convinced that the compost that they're getting out of those municipal composting programs is all that useful and all that good. I don't even know what they do with it, but it may again be performative rather than actually useful.
Okay. Well, Lloyd, again, thank you very much for virtually coming to Amherstburg. The book is a great read. As I was telling Lloyd before we made it public, the amount of research in this is quite amazing. And, you know, he's been writing for years for Tree Hugger. I mentioned he's written 14,000 articles and he's obviously drawn on them. It's an easy read. It's 142 pages. I really encourage you to get it. And even more than the fact that I sell them at the bookstore. It's really just a great read, whether you go online or buy it at the bookstore. So
buy it
again,
in the bookstore. Support your local independent bookstore.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'll send your check later. Can we go to the next slide there, Corey? So Amherstburg, we talked about doing white papers. We Open Air goes to council October 12th. That's public. It's on at 6 o'clock. You can see that and follow the debate. In all of our white papers, we address climate change, and you know, we mention it in this paper. Not a great deal, but you know what Open Air is about? It's encouraging walking. It's encouraging cycling. So yes, it is in its own way addressing climate change. Heritage goes to a council on the 25th, and it has a you know, restoring a building is a lot more environmentally better than destroying it and putting it all in landfill. And if the restoring means better windows and some insulation, it makes for a better house. And then we have a climate crisis white paper going sometime in November. In each case, we make them public when it goes to council, and we're going to ask you what you think of them. So the people on Open Air, for the last week, people have been reading that and telling us what they think of our recommendations. So we will share that. That's new news that we'll share to council on the 12th. But we really encourage you to read them. They're evidence-based. They've got lots of best practices, and they always believe the science. And so what we say is we'll show you them. So read them, study them, and see if you agree. Maybe you don't agree. Not everyone agreed with our white paper on Open Air. The great majority did, overwhelmingly, but there's other people that don't, and you know, it's democracy, and we understand that. Next slide. So Thrive Amherstburg, and it's, you know, Amherstburg's a very good town. We're not saying it isn't. We're just collectively trying to engage and educate people and doing things that make it even better. So thank you for participating in the 9th Zoom. We look forward to having you on a future Zoom. And Lloyd, again, thank you so much. Thanks for writing this book, and thanks for spending an hour of your time with us in Amherstburg. We really appreciate it.
Can I say one more thing to address something you're doing? Just a reminder that, and I mentioned it passing in the book, but heritage preservation is climate action. If you remember that point that I made through the book about embodied carbon, as soon as you take down a building and replace it, that's all new material, new metal, new steel, new concrete, new burps of upfront carbon emissions, which is why one of the cardinal rules of green building is save what you have, reuse and repurpose rather than tearing it down. And I should have put that in the speech, having known you were into heritage, but there it is now.
It is in our white paper. I'm not sure it's written as well as you just said, but it is raised. And I know Pat Simone, who's on the Heritage Committee. I'll be chatting with the Heritage Committee on the 14th, and Pat's a big champion of heritage, and she'll be at that committee meeting with me. So again, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lloyd. And, you know, everyone help make Amherstburg thrive. Good night, everyone.